What if one man could have reshaped the entire world before the rise of Rome? And what if that man, barely in his 20s, stood on the edge of conquering the greatest empire the ancient world had ever seen? Alexander of Macedon, known to us as Alexander the Great, had already carved his name into history with lightning victories and daring marches across Asia. But here's the question most people never ask. What if he had gone further? What if Alexander had not stopped short, but had swallowed the Persian Empire whole and wielded its immense wealth, armies, and cities as his own? This isn't just a story about conquest. It's about the razor's edge of possibility. Imagine a world where one man ruled from Greece to India, from Egypt to the steppes of Central Asia. Could democracy, philosophy, and Greek culture have dominated centuries earlier? Or would Alexander have created a super empire so powerful it might have lasted for millennia? Stay with me, because in this journey we'll walk the dusty roads of Persia, ride alongside Alexander's companions, and peer into a future that almost was. And if you love stories where history meets possibility, make sure to subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. What do you build when the world you just seized is too vast for one lifetime? And what price do you pay to convince millions of strangers that your crown belongs on their heads, as well as your own? Part 1. Babylon breathes. The gates of Babylon opened with a sigh, as if an old empire were exhaling the last of its resistance. Dust drifted like incense. Priests in conical hats chanted blessings. Veterans with scarred cheeks squinted through the glare. At the center, on a stallion that seemed bred from thunder, Alexander rode beneath a forest of spear points that caught the sun and turned it into fireflies. He had stood at Granicus and Issus, and he had shattered the host of Darius on a field that seemed too wide for any human drama. He had outpaced couriers, outmaneuvered kingdoms, and outlived prophecies. Now, in our imagined path, he did not pause at the threshold. He crossed it with the calm of a man who knows he has arrived precisely where he intended. Imagine the camera rising over the Euphrates at dusk. The water is bronze. Barges drift past mud-brick quays where scribes tally grain and perfumes. In this city, anything that can be counted is power. Alexander dismounts not to gloat, but to listen. He asks for tax rolls. He asks for water charts. He asks for the map of canals as if they were arteries of a patient he plans to heal. He knows the Persian Empire was not only an army. It was a system that made deserts feed cities and mountains bow to roads. If he means to rule, he must take its heartbeat into his palm. Here is the first choice of our new timeline. In our world, he burned Persepolis in a gesture that was part vengeance, part theater. In this world of what might have been, he walks its columns at night, fingers brushing cuneiform like a reader touching braille, and he spares it. He orders torches doused, wine jugs sealed, storerooms catalogued. We will inherit, not insult, he tells the commanders. Murmurs rise, because some men wanted a bonfire to warm their pride. But he shakes out the ember before it can catch. He is thinking of something larger than satisfaction. He is thinking of legitimacy. Battlefields made him a legend. Paperwork could make him eternal. He invites Persian secretaries into the council tent and assigns Macedonian companions to sit beside them, not above them. Gold seals and Greek signatures share the same page. He adopts the long, rug-lined walkways of the Persian court, but shortens their ritual bows. He accepts rich robes at festivals. Then he hunts in hard leather at dawn. He is not becoming Persian. He is binding the words king and king of kings into one breath he alone can exhale. There is resistance, of course, the kind that doesn't shout, but hardens silently, like clay left too long in the sun. A captain whispers that the old ways kept men sharp. An old officer mutters that silk makes soft generals. Alexander listens, and he smiles with the fatigue of someone who has done the math on human pride. Night falls. He walks the procession road where lions stride in baked blue tile. The moon turns the tiles silver. A child runs alongside, poor, fearless, hungry. The boy asks, "Are you the one who speaks for both our gods?" Alexander kneels to his height. "I speak for roads and harvests and for soldiers who come home," he answers. The boy nods, because that is the sort of theology that feeds a family, not just a temple. Did you know? The Persian royal road once ferried messages from one end of the empire to the other faster than a change of seasons. Couriers rode in relays with fresh horses at every station, carrying leather packets stamped with the winged symbol of Ahura Mazda. Alexander looks at that system and does not see an artifact. He sees a network to be tuned. He orders the relay stations repaired and expanded, new ones placed along the Macedonian routes, Greek and Aramaic side by side on fresh signposts. He sets scribes to standardize weights and measures, mint coins with his profile and a Persian fire altar on the reverse, a promise that the old and the new will share the same purse. They say that money is trust made metal. He wants his face to be the shape of trust. Still, you cannot hold an empire steady without showing the sword. On the edge of the empire, in the mountains where traders swear by their own gods and tax collectors vanish into ravines, satraps test the new king's reach. He answers not only with phalanx and cavalry, but with bridges. Imagine a scene of carpenters lashing rafts together while trumpets call across water. He does not smash a hill tribe and leave. He garrisons a crossroads and digs a well. His orders turn to aphorisms the men repeat at night. Smash what threatens, feed what obeys, bind what floats apart. It is rule as architecture. And then comes the moment that nearly breaks everything. At a great banquet in Babylon, beneath cedar beams perfumed with imported resin, he announces a marriage festival. Macedonian officers take noble Persian brides. Persian nobles take Macedonian brides. The hall is a mosaic of embroidered sleeves and bronze greaves, coal-lined eyes and sun-scarred faces. Some men grin, drunk on possibility. Others stiffen, feeling their old certainties turning to wax. When Alexander stands, the room falls quiet. I will not force men to love each other, he says, but I will make it impossible for them to ignore each other. There is laughter at the poetry and a murmur at the threat. He drinks with both hands, the Greek sign for abundance and the Persian sign for oath. In one night, he throws a grappling hook over the abyss between two armies and dares his friends to hold the rope. You can almost hear the flint strike the steel when the veterans gather after midnight, armor half unbuckled, pride fully awake. We did not march to bow, one says. We did not bleed to share, another adds. By dawn, the hum of grievance is loud enough to rattle the tent ropes. The king appears before breakfast. No jewels, no plume, just dust on his boots and a voice that could slice leather. He reminds them who rode at their head when rivers ran red. He reminds them who paid their widows and who sent wagons of grain to their villages. Then he does something unexpected. He announces a lottery of estates in the rich lands near Susa for the men who will stay on and build, not just break. Some frown. Some lean forward as if hearing their names already called. He is not bribing. He is buying time for an idea to take root. And here comes the surge, the moment that pulls the story taut. Word arrives from the Gulf that a harbor can be carved from the marsh where the river meets the sea, a place where reed beds whisper and the horizon looks like a promise. He sees not water, but route. He summons shipwrights from Phoenicia and Egypt, orders timber floated down from the mountains, and sets thousands to raise masts where fishermen once mended nets. Why turn to the sea? Because empires that master land may feed themselves, but empires that master water feed others and tax the appetite of the world. Spices, pearls, incense, Indian cotton, Arabian horses. The catalog of luxuries is also a map of influence. There is risk in any pivot. The men who want another march east grip spears' hafts and mutter that sailors stink of tar and stories. But Alexander reads the wind better than they do. Arabia hugs the sea like a sleeping panther, and beyond it the routes to the Horn of Africa, to the delta of the Indus, to ports where the night markets smell like cinnamon and wet rope. If he can thread those harbors into a necklace and wear it around Babylon's throat, he can choke or feed nations with a tug. Have you ever wondered, the narrator asks softly as the camera drifts over a blueprint splayed with pebbles to hold it flat, how much of history is won not by swords, but by schedules? A fleet requires more than wood. It requires provisioning tables, wind charts, contracts, and faith that tomorrow's tide will meet today's plan. Alexander appoints a Persian admiral with a Greek deputy and gives them joint authority. The message is dangerous and deliberate. If one betrays him, the other must betray his own people to conspire. Loyalty is safer when it is divided against itself and drawn together at the top. In the shipyards, boys shout, ropes creak, and hammers ring. The king walks among them with sleeves rolled and questions that cut to the core. How many days of dried fish can a trireme carry without spoiling? How high must a harbor beacon be to be seen over a squall? Which turn of the tide makes the mouth of the river safest to cross? He looks up when a crane lifts a keel into brilliance. For a breath, he closes his eyes. He is not thinking of glory. He is thinking of timetables and wheat shipments, and whether the men will call him father or judge when the sea claims its share. Our road dips and rises. News arrives of a satrap upriver skimming taxes and whipping laborers to death. The old empire could absorb such rot. The new one cannot. Alexander rides with a flying column, the dust of his escort boiling behind him. He dismounts at the man's court and orders ledgers opened in front of the crowd, column after column of numbers like ranks of ants. His finger stops. He does not shout. He simply says, "You stole days from your people, and I am taking them back." The satrap is stripped and sent under guard to a trial that is not theater but arithmetic. Men watch and measure the king's face. Is he Greek? Is he Persian? Is he both? He does not answer with words. He answers with ration chits and repaired canals and a tax schedule that arrives on time. At dusk, in a quiet room above the river, Aristotle's letters wait. The parchment smells like oil and thought. The teacher warns gently of monarchy that eats its own virtues, praises the blending of customs when the core remains steady, and asks whether a man can be a citizen of a world that has never known. The streets of Susa baked under a sun that could melt silver, but the city was alive. Caravans groaned beneath sacks of spices and bolts of silk, soldiers marched in dusty rhythm, and priests murmured hymns to the fire that never died. Into this furnace rode Alexander, not as a plunderer, but as a master who had decided not to scorch, but to bind here. He called his generals and Persian satraps together in a hall where pillars glowed like molten bronze in the torchlight. His voice was calm, but each word seemed to slice across the air. We have taken Babylon. We have secured Persepolis. But conquest is the beginning, not the end. If we wish to hold the Persian Empire entire, we must not think as Macedonians or Persians. We must think as something greater. He did not say it aloud, but all knew the word that hovered in the silence. Universal, at first, many resisted. Parmenian's ghost still haunted the tents, and veterans of Issus muttered over wine that Alexander was no longer theirs. They remembered the boy who charged with them through Anatolia, who laughed with them under raw hides when storms lashed the plains. Now he wore Persian robes, sat on Persian thrones, married Persian nobility. To them, it felt like watching their own reflection vanish from the mirror, but Alexander was not blind to their whispers. He called an assembly in the central square of Susa, where Macedonian hoplites stood shoulder to shoulder with Persian archers. With deliberate slowness, he stepped onto a raised platform. In one hand, he carried a Macedonian spear. In the other, a Persian bow. "I am both," he said simply, raising the weapons above his head. "And so are you, if you choose to live in this empire. No man loses himself here. He gains 1,000 brothers." Some jeered, but others felt the weight of possibility in his words. It was not enough to speak unity. He had to carve it into the bones of the empire. So he began to move, not with armies, but with architects. Roads stretched from Susa like veins of stone. Surveyors marked lines with cords and poles, and behind them followed thousands of laborers, Persians and Macedonians alike, laying slabs, digging drainage, and raising mile markers. When locals asked why, Alexander's officers answered, "So the king may reach you, and so you may reach the king." It was the first hint that this empire was not meant to be one-sided conquest, but an experiment in scale no man had attempted before, and yet, danger lurked beneath the mortar. For every road built, a pocket of resistance boiled. In the Zagros Mountains, rebel clans struck caravans. In Egypt, priests whispered that foreign kings could never truly honor the gods of the Nile. In Bactria, warriors swore to their ancestors they would never kneel. Alexander did not meet these crises with brute force alone. He rode out with his companions, but he also left behind governors who distributed grain, lowered taxes, and allowed temples to rebuild. His strategy was simple and terrifying in its foresight. Bind loyalty not only with blood, but with bread. One night, in his chambers at Susa, Alexander studied a map spread across a cedar table. He placed small carved figures at the edges, an eagle to the west, a horse to the east, a ship to the south. His mind raced. Could he stretch his hand to Carthage? To Arabia? Even to the edges of the known ocean? He whispered to himself, "If the world has an edge, I must stand on it." His advisors warned that the men were weary, that their homes longed for their return. But Alexander's home had become the horizon itself, and he was not ready to stop at a gathering storm. The empire was shifting under his feet, and Alexander knew it. In our world, his soldiers grew restless and forced him to turn back from the edge of India. But here, something different takes root. At Susa, Alexander calls for a second marriage festival, grander, more deliberate than before. This time, it is not only Macedonians taking Persian brides, but Persians, Egyptians, and Greeks intermarrying under his supervision. The hall glows with gold and laughter, but beneath the music lies unease. Old warriors feel their identity dissolving, as if Alexander were asking them to become citizens of a dream they never chose. And then the storm breaks. A group of officers, hardened veterans of the early campaigns, gather in secret. They speak not of loyalty, but of betrayal. He was ours, one spits, and now he is theirs. They plot not rebellion on the battlefield, but whispers at the banquet, daggers in the dark. Word drifts to Alexander through channels even his enemies do not understand. He calls the men to him, unarmed, unguarded, and listens as they pour their anger into the night air. He does not punish them. Instead, he grants them estates far from the court, lands rich with soil but poor in politics. He turns enemies into landlords, giving them something more powerful than resentment, a stake in the empire's future. Still, unease lingers. For every man who settles, another longs for home. For every Persian who embraces Alexander, another waits for him to falter. The empire breathes, restless, as if deciding whether to accept this half-Greek, half-Persian master. The edge of the world, but Alexander's gaze is already shifting farther. His fleet, newly launched from Babylon, hugs the Arabian coast. Reports come back of strange harbors, of tribes who worship stars as gods, of riches traded in markets lit by lanterns of fish oil. He dreams of Arabia as a jewel to clasp his empire shut, a final frontier to prove that his dominion is not just land but sea. The campaign begins. Ships slice the Gulf, their sails swelling with promise. On shore, Alexander marches beside them, his army a ribbon of bronze and dust. At first, the conquest seems simple. Coastal towns fall, tribes submit, and the Macedonians grow fat on dates and fish. But then the desert turns against them. Water skins crackle empty, and men collapse under the sun. Horses shriek as their hooves split on jagged salt flats. The empire that seemed endless suddenly feels fragile against the cruelty of nature itself. Here, Alexander faces his greatest trial. In one searing afternoon, a column nearly perishes. The men stumble into camp, lips blackened, eyes glazed. One soldier, trembling, offers Alexander his helmet filled with the last drops of water from a hidden spring. Alexander looks at it, then tips it into the sand where it vanishes instantly. "If my men thirst, then I thirst," he declares. The gesture spreads like fire. The army steadies. For a moment, loyalty outlasts despair, but Arabia does not surrender so easily. Storms rip sails, tribes vanish into dunes, and rumors spread that the gods themselves resist the march. And yet, Alexander pushes on. His map gains new edges, new coastlines inked in by weary scribes. He is not conquering Arabia. He is forcing it to reveal itself. In doing so, he binds his men to something greater than plunder. Discovery that a shadow from the west when Alexander returns to Susa. Thinner, darker, but unbroken, he finds something waiting that chills him more than the desert ever could. The Roman envoys have returned. This time, they come not as humble emissaries, but with the confidence of men whose republic has begun to stretch its wings. They bring stories of disciplined legions, of consuls who share power, of citizens who fight for their state as much as their general. They are not yet an empire, but Alexander sees in them the glimmer of what might be. He watches them drill in a courtyard, their shields locking with machine-like precision. He listens to their debates, sharp, reasoned, defiant. And in a rare moment of silence, he admits to himself that he has found a people who might, someday, rival even his vision. He does not strike them down. Instead, he offers them a pact, trade, roads, and mutual recognition. The Romans nod, but their eyes glint with something dangerous, respect mixed with calculation. And so the chapter closes with the empire at a crossroads. Alexander has bound Persia more tightly than any conqueror before him. He has carved roads, launched fleets, marched into deserts, and returned alive. But now, a shadow looms, not from the east, but from a small city far to the west. Rome watches, learns, and waits. The audience feels it too, that shiver of inevitability. For if Alexander had conquered the Persian Empire in its entirety, could even he have foreseen the seed of a republic that would one day rise to challenge everything he built? The night deepens over Susa. The Roman eagle and the Persian fire altar glinting side by side on his table as Alexander leans forward, eyes fixed on a horizon only he can see. Rain prowled the edges of Babylon like a cat that hadn't yet decided whether to pounce. In the torchlit courtyards, armor steamed, horses tossed their heads, and the river moved with the patience of a god that outlived kings. Alexander stood on a balcony with the city's breath rising to meet him, the Roman eagle carving and the Persian fire altar glinting side by side on the table behind. He was thinking not of trophies, but of training schedules, tax calendars, canal sluices, and 1,000 promises that could not be delayed by weather. By morning, he was on the road to Opis, the place where the Tigris pinches toward the mountains and the old royal road throws a stone step into the river. He rode light, with Hephaestion beside him, their conversation a soft braid of planning, teasing, and the kind of silence shared only by men who have survived each other's worst days. The camp's smoke thinned, the city's noise dissolved, and the hum of marching feet became the measure of time. At Opis, the army gathered. Macedonian veterans in sun-bleached cloaks, Persian recruits in fresh linen, the 30,000 youths drilled in the Macedonian manner, spears so new the wood still smelled of sap. Alexander walked the lines as if reading a poem in a language he had taught himself to love. He knew what this would feel like for the old guard, a dilution. He also knew what the empire needed, an infusion. He called the assembly on a platform hastily hammered together from wagons. The air tasted like distant rain and sharpened iron. Men of Macedon, he began, and then, with deliberate care, men of Asia. The shift of phrase was small. The tremor it caused wasn't. He spoke of roads laid from Susa to the sea, of canals dredged so that wheat could float instead of the backs of farmers breaking beneath it, of coinage stamped with a face and a fire that together promised not just rule, but routine. If this empire is to be more than a victory parade, he said, it must be a place where a child in Bactria and a merchant in Memphis know the price of barley without needing a priest to consult the clouds. Murmurs. The veterans were proud of barley won by spearpoint, not by a ledger. Then came the scrape. Alexander announced the elevation of the Persian-trained youths into the line, their shields not as symbols, but as tools. A ripple of dissent became a wave. Voices rose, thick with salt and memory. We followed you when no one knew your name, a captain shouted. Now you bid us share our place with boys who never bled at Issus? The air pulled tight. Hephaestion's hand hovered a breath from Alexander's arm, the way you raise a palm near a door you might need to slam. Alexander did not lift his voice. He let the noise spend itself like a storm that throws its lightning first, and only then its rain. When the shouting faltered, he spoke in a tone that carried as far as anger. You say you made me, he said. You did. And I made you. I made you richer than your fathers, and more famous than your grandfathers. And I brought you to cities your ancestors could not have spoken the names of. I offered you homes on land your sons can plow with steel instead of hunger. He paused, and the rain finally started to patter, soft, insistent, inevitable. You want the old army? Take it. Take your discharge, your pay, your estates in Susa's green fields. Go home, and leave me the future. It should have shattered the camp. Instead, something in the way he said future bent the anger and turned it back on itself. The men stared at their boots, at the rain striping the dirt, at the Persian youths who didn't know whether to look proud or ashamed. An old veteran, one ear scarred, one eye clouded, shuffled forward. "King," he said, voice rough as a saw, "I don't want to farm. I want to be where the map ends." Laughter cracked the tension. Shoulders loosened. Hands reached out, gripping forearms, acknowledging a brother drawn in a different alphabet, but a brother still. By dusk, the army swore again, not to a tribe or a language, but to a standard that carried both a spear and a flame. Did you know? The Persians had perfected qanats, underground water channels that turned deserts into orchards. Alexander announced a levy not of captives, but of engineers. Learn the qanat, teach the Greeks. Learn the phalanx, teach the Persians. Not conquest, but exchange, enforced by the man who could ram you with cavalry if you were late to class. With Opus settled, he returned to the sea road. The harbor at the river's mouth had grown from rumor to geometry. Breakwaters of stone, wharves of cedar, beacons rising like stitched stars along the coast. Nearchus, his admiral, unrolled a chart crushed with creases of sweat. "We can ride the winds farther than we thought," he said, tapping a line that hugged the Arabian shore. "If we push with the gentle breezes, then wait, then leap with the monsoon, we can reach lands where cinnamon grows without asking anyone's permission. If roads are veins, winds are nerves," Alexander thought, and smiled. He had learned to love schedules more than thunder. Shipwrights clattered under awnings, scribes counted nails and dried fish, and an Egyptian pilot taught a Macedonian how to read stars without a poet's help. The empire was turning into a school, and the headmaster walked the corridors with dust on his cuffs. Then the sky split. Wind came riddled with grit, the color of old bronze. The river swelled as if a hidden hand had poured a lake into it upstream. Cords snapped, masts groaned. A warehouse door bucked its hinges and flew like a card. Someone screamed that the gods had found the seam in the king's plan and tugged. The harbor wasn't ready. New works are shy. They do not like to be stared at by storms. Alexander was already knee-deep in water when Hephaestion reached him. "The eastern dike," he shouted over the roar. "If it holds, the whole harbor goes under." Alexander's eyes moved fast, seesawing between ruin and remedy. "Cut it," he said. "Let the Tigris braid itself with the marsh and find its temper downstream." "We'll lose the warehouse," Hephaestion warned. "Better a lung than the heart," Alexander answered, and plunged up the embankment, knife between his teeth like some reckless story he would have mocked in another life. Men hacked at the dike until the mud bled. When the cut gave, it did so with a sound that felt like a city exhaling. Water tore through the gap. The harbor slackened. Ropes went from screams to sighs. A mast toppled anyway, snapping like a bone. Hephaestion shoved a boy out from under it, took the blow across his shoulder, and hit the ground with a sound that Alexander had dreaded in too many dreams. The king was beside him in the same breath, not king now, but friend. "Breathe," he said, as if the command might carry heavier than air, and for a moment it seemed to work. Hephaestion grinned with one corner of his mouth. "If the empire is a ship," he whispered, "you need someone to tell you when the sails are lying." "I chose a friend I could not replace," Alexander said, so quietly that the river had to lean in to hear. Hephaestion lived. The shoulder knit crooked, his strength came back like a wary animal, but he lived. Alexander turned the shipyard into a temple of gratitude for a week. Ration doubled. Pay on time. A bronze plaque hammered to the beacon that read, simply, "Saved by a wound." In victory, he threw festivals. In survival, he learned to make vows. The Romans returned while Hephaestion wore his arm in a sling. Their leader this time was younger, face too smooth for the wear in his eyes. He watched the harbor with the fascination of a man memorizing a secret. At dinner, he laid out a wooden model of a legion's formation, maniples like chess pieces, lanes for reinforcement, the rhythm of their drum pulses. Alexander answered with a cavalry wedge carved from olive wood, showed how shock could unravel a line, how speed turns a plan into a guess. They spoke as craftsmen do, admiring the other's instruments without confessing how they might be used against one another. Later, Alexander found the Romans studying a road map with the hunger of a thief. "You take notes with soldiers' eyes," the king said. "We take notes," the Roman replied, "because the world is bigger than our pride." It sounded like compliment. It tasted like reconnaissance. What do you do when you discover your guests are drawing your house from memory? Alexander did not arrest him. He invited him to a review instead. Thousands of mixed-rank troops marched past, Persian boys and Macedonian men turning their spears and eyes together as if choreographed by a god who liked the look of discipline. Alexander let the Roman applaud with polite envy, then sent him home with gifts that would take a long time to sell and a rumor to carry, that the king would soon look west with ships instead of steps. Sometimes what you let an enemy overhear is the ingredient that seasons your true intention. A courier came from the east with a letter sealed in saffron thread. The messenger was a Jain merchant with dust in his beard and the cool patience of someone who has seen more droughts than wars. The letter spoke of a young man in the Ganges country with a mind like a net and a fist like a hammer, a prince who distrusted kings and looked for a new way to hold a country together. The name was still small enough to fit on one line, Chandragupta. Alexander read it twice, folded it as if tucking a bird into his palm, and put it beside the Roman eagle. East and west, two sparks flickered on his table, each a story that might one day want to set the world on fire. Did you know? Greek sailors who guessed at the monsoons became rich not by being brave, but by being punctual. Nearchus begged for permission to push farther, to draw lines on the water that no one had drawn before. He had his calculations, his pilots, his faith in stars that did not lie. The messenger from the Indus had not even finished his bow before Alexander snatched the blue-threaded stick from his hands. He broke the seal, and the parchment inside was damp with sweat from the runner's chest. The words were spare but heavy. Uprisings along the far eastern routes, stirred by a figure whose name was beginning to spread in marketplaces and tea stalls. Chandragupta. Alexander stared at the name. It was not yet carved in marble, not yet sung in theaters, but he felt in his bones that this was not the last time he would hear it. His empire was stretching like leather on a frame, pulled tighter than even his victories could hold. To the west, Rome was learning. To the east, India was stirring. And in the middle, millions of hearts beat to the rhythm of promises he had made in moments of fire and urgency. At Aethiopis, he had forced his men to accept Persians as brothers. At Babylon, he had ordered roads and canals repaired. At the Gulf, he had carved a harbor out of marsh. And yet, was it enough? Or was the world itself reminding him that no man, no matter how great, could truly clasp it whole? He paced in silence long after the council had dissolved, Hephaestion watching from the shadows. "You have the seas," his friend said gently. "You have the roads. You even have the stars. What else is there to take?" Alexander stopped, his silhouette caught against the fire. "Time," he whispered. "I cannot conquer time." Poison in the feast. The months that followed were a blur of construction and decree. Canals extended like veins into barren fields. A library began to rise in Babylon, scrolls flowing in from Athens, Memphis, and Persepolis. He dreamed of a single hall where the world's knowledge might breathe under one roof. Yet as his plans multiplied, so did the shadows. A banquet meant to honor the marriage of a Macedonian general to a Persian noblewoman. A servant slipped in wine from a jug that had not been sealed with the royal stamp. By midnight, two men lay writhing, their throats burning as if fire itself had been poured into them. Alexander was furious, but not surprised. He had made too many enemies among both his old guard and the Persian elites. Someone had tried to poison loyalty itself. The guilty servant confessed under questioning, but when pressed for a master, he bit his tongue until he drowned in his own blood. Was it a lone act of desperation? Or had the conspiracy run deeper, perhaps all the way to men who still smiled in council by day and sharpened knives by night? Alexander didn't know, and that uncertainty gnawed at him more than any open war ever had. The dream of cities. If Alexander could not silence enemies in the shadows, he would drown them in light. He began laying plans for new cities, dozens, then scores, each named Alexandria, each a beacon that would fuse cultures and tether distant lands. Some were ports, some garrison towns, some mere lines on a map awaiting walls. To the veterans, it felt like madness. "Why not let the ones we already built grow?" one asked. Alexander's answer was quiet but final. "Because I am building not homes, but a pattern." In one such city near the Oxus, Greek soldiers and Persian merchants argued over the price of grain until night fell. But the very next morning, they broke bread at the same table, bound by contracts drawn up in both tongues. A traveler could walk through the gate of an Alexandria in Bactria and find olive oil from Greece, spices from India, and scribes reciting Homer in one street while Zoroastrian hymns echoed in the next. The vision was real, tangible, intoxicating. But it came at a cost. Every city drained coin, drained men, drained the king himself. Hephaestion began to notice it first. The cough that shook Alexander's frame when the nights grew cold, the way he pressed a hand to his ribs after long rides. He said nothing, because Alexander was not a man you reminded of his limits. But the silence between them grew heavier, like an unspoken prophecy neither dared give voice to. The lion's breath fades, and then, the blow that could have unmade him. Hephaestion, his closest companion, the man who had been with him since boyhood, fell ill. At first, it seemed a fever, the kind soldiers shrugged off with bitter herbs and a few days' rest. But soon he weakened, his strength seeping away like water through sand. Alexander stayed at his side, refusing to leave even when generals begged for decisions. The conqueror who had faced Darius, who had tamed Egypt, who had marched through deserts that devoured armies. This man now watched helplessly as his dearest friend's breath rattled and faltered. When Hephaestion died, Babylon shook. Not with rebellion, not with riots, but with grief so sharp it cut the city's heart. Alexander draped himself in black, refused food for days, and ordered sacred flames extinguished across the empire. "A king has fallen," he said, though he was still alive. For in his mind, part of him had died with the man who knew him not as a god or a conqueror, but as a boy who once dreamed on Macedonian hillsides. The empire waited, breath held, as its master stumbled under a weight no army had ever placed on him. The unfinished map from his grief rose something colder, sharper, more dangerous than ambition. Alexander began to plan on a scale even his companions could not fathom. He called for shipwrights to design vessels that could sail beyond Arabia, past the Horn of Africa, even into the vast western sea that no man had yet crossed. He spoke of sending expeditions north into the steppes, where horse tribes roamed like shadows. He dreamed of one empire, one world, one map without blank spaces. But in the council chambers, unease hardened. His generals, once intoxicated by conquest, now saw exhaustion in their men, famine in provinces stretched thin, and whispers of revolt that carried like sparks on dry wind. To them, Alexander's dreams had become a fever, the dreams of a man who wanted to outlive mortality itself, and perhaps they were right at a question of gods one night. Alexander walked alone through the half-built library in Babylon. Scrolls and tablets lay stacked like bones. He paused before a clay tablet inscribed with the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero who sought immortality, who crossed the seas and returned with nothing but wisdom. That story was older than the empire, older than his people, older even than the Persian kings he had replaced. Alexander read the lines by torchlight, and for the first time, he felt not only kinship but warning. "Is this how they will write of me?" He whispered to the shadows. A man who sought to hold the world in his hands, and found only sand. His voice echoed in the hollow chamber, and for once, no answer came. The unresolved horizon, the Roman envoys had gone home. Chandragupta stirred in the east. Roads stretched farther than they could be patrolled, harbors deeper than they could be filled, cities rising faster than they could be supplied. And at the heart of it all stood Alexander, thinner, haunted, but unbroken, trying to wrestle both the world and his own dwindling breath into obedience. One evening, as Babylon's ziggurat cast its long shadow over the river, he gathered his generals and pointed west, past the setting sun. "There is more," he said simply. "Always more." His voice was soft, but it carried the weight of command. Some men nodded, still bound by loyalty. Others bowed their heads, already calculating how much longer the dream could hold. The river lapped softly at the quays, carrying whispers from 1,000 lands. Alexander looked at it as if it might answer him, as if somewhere in its reflection he could glimpse the edge of time itself. And so we leave him there, standing on the banks of Babylon, one hand on the map, the other on his sword, staring at a horizon that seemed to beckon and mock in equal measure. Because what if he had lived just a little longer? What if he had taken one more campaign, built one more city, or faced Rome before it rose? Would the world as we know it even exist? The question hangs in the Babylonian dusk, waiting for history to breathe its answer. Babylon woke to the sound of hammers and hymns. In the courtyards where Hephaestion's bier had stood, work gangs now raised scaffolds for a hall of debate, the place Alexander swore would carry his will even when his voice was elsewhere on the wind. He walked among them at dawn, cloak plain, eyes darker than sleep could cure. The Roman eagle carving and the Persian fire altar still shared his table. Beside them lay a clay tablet from the Indus, the script like river reeds, the name inside already whispering through markets. Chandragupta, he called the empire to listen. Not armies, people. Satraps, city elders, caravan chiefs, ship captains, temple stewards, Greek scholars with ink on their fingers, Persian judges whose beards held more winter than most men's lives. They gathered beneath cedar beams in a hall washed clean for mourning and made ready for law. Alexander stood with nothing in his hands, as if to prove he needed no prop but breath. "This cannot be my empire," he said quietly, and the murmur ran like a startled school of fish. "If it depends on me, it is a tent in a wind. It must be a house that remembers how to stand." He laid out what the scribes would later call the Babylon Edict. Greek polis would keep their assemblies. Persian districts would keep their satrapal ledgers. Taxes would be counted by two scripts that agreed before coin moved. Canals and roads would be a crown possession no governor could sell. Temples would answer to their gods for ritual and to the courts for land. Soldiers' pay would follow harvest calendars so farmers did not feed victories with famine. And citizenship, he said, letting the word find its place in the room, is not blood. It is oath and work. The old guard stiffened, then read the faces of merchants who had waited their whole lives for rules that arrived on time. A city thrives on the feeling that tomorrow will behave. Alexander, who once conquered with speed, now conquered with schedule, did you know? He asked later that afternoon, standing under a map stitched with colored threads. If you sail from the mouth of the Tigris with the summer breeze, then wait in Oman for the sky to turn. The ocean itself will carry you like a patient ox along the coast of Arabia to the mouth of the Red Sea. Nearchus tapped the chart, eyes bright as a boy's. If we place brine wells here, and plant beacon fires along the cliffs, we can stitch the Gulf to the Nile and make the sea a road as certain as stone. He made the sea his second capital. Garrisons became warehouses. Warehouses became markets. Markets called out for laws, and the new hall in Babylon answered with codes sailors could understand. Weights, measures, hull draft limits, pilots' fees, punishments for dumping ballast in narrow channels. The empire felt different when ships left on a tide rather than a rumor. Trouble came anyway. It always does. In Bactria, a band of hard men who had never forgiven the marriages at Susa ambushed a convoy of engineers, burned their surveying cords, and scrawled a message on a stone. We were soldiers, not masons. In Egypt, priests muttered that the king loved ships too much and the Nile too little. In the Zagros, a satrap tried to hide a second set of books under a false floor. Alexander did not gallop out with only spears. He sent judges who spoke both tongues and soldiers who kept their swords sheathed while scribes counted. When the false floor opened and the second ledger came up blinking into light, the city square held its breath. The satrap was not executed. He was sentenced to repair the very canals whose funds he'd stolen, his family's name posted at every sluice gate as guarantors. Shame watered the fields better than blood. The fever took him in the third month of the hot season. It came like a thief, cold first, then flame, then the feeling that your bones are tuning forks for a song you did not ask to hear. The physicians argued, bitter herbs, cool baths, prayers, bleeding. He refused the last. I have lost enough, he said, and turned his face to the wall only to turn it back again when Hephaestion's absence made the room tilt. 3 nights and days, stars like nails, breath like rope. On the 4th morning, he sat up with the look of a man who has decided to live, not because he believes he will, but because he refuses to make dying easy. The city cheered without shouting. Relief in Babylon moved quietly, like water in a well that he shaved his beard to the skin. A votive for recovered days, and went to the shipyards the same afternoon, where a Phoenician caulker showed him a split in a keel. Wood lies, the man said, pressing his thumb into the seam. If you only look, it looks whole. If you feel, it tells you the weather it remembers. Alexander ran his hand along the grain and nodded. He touched the empire that way now, not trusting the glance when the truth was in the pressure. News from the east thickened like syrup. Chandragupta's name gathered verbs: mustered, persuaded, marched. Not a bandit, not a prince who waited for inheritance, but a builder, and builders recognize each other across distance. Alexander sent gifts that were also questions: a bronze mirror, a whetstone, a map of the satrapies between the Indus and the sea. The reply came on bark smooth as skin: an ivory die, a measure of rice, a sketch of elephants bridled in silk. If worlds are to be neighbors, the message said, let them trade more than insults. He invited him to Babylon. When the Indian delegation entered the hall of debate, the city's tongues tripped over their own curiosity. The ambassador wore linen that breathed where Babylon's air struggled. He bowed neither like a Persian nor like a Greek. He placed a palm on his chest and said, in careful Greek, I speak for a man who intends to build a country with laws as straight as roads. Alexander's smile was not wide. It was deep. They talked for hours without wine. The offer that would have cracked lesser pride came like a stone placed gently on a table. Alexander would recognize Mauryan's sovereignty east of the Indus. In return, he would receive 500 elephants, 10 years of stable trade, and a promise to police the passes so that no bandit prince could bleed caravans dry. His generals stared as if someone had suggested selling a sunrise. Alexander studied the map until silence grew tired. We draw a line not to divide, he said, but to keep the drawing possible. He signed. A Greek scribe and an Indian clerk wrote the terms on papyrus and palm leaf, two scripts binding one decision. When the elephants paraded through Babylon weeks later, the city fell silent the way children do when they meet a myth that is larger than their fear. Alexander watched, hands behind his back, calculating not how to win a battle with them, but how to win a century. Did you know? A trained elephant can push a siege tower like a bored man moves a stool. A disciplined maniple will not break if its officers have taught it that fear has a rhythm and steps around it. Alexander sent one elephant west with a small escort and a letter to Rome that did not threaten. It asked a question: do your citizens wish to trade for wonders or to bleed for them? The Senate's answer would take months to arrive. In the meantime, Carthaginian merchants began to smell profit and danger mingling on the same breeze. The sea ring hardened. Dara hauled frankincense to the quays. Omani harbors learned to count and invoice. Yemeni pilots taught Greeks to read a coast by taste and sound as well as sight. In the Red Sea, he found wreckers with lanterns who lured ships to rocks. He built a chain of watchtowers and paid fishermen to lie awake and tell the truth. He stood on a dune one dusk as the sun went down swallowing its own light, and said to Nearchus, I used to think the world ended where the land quit. It ends where the rules change. Rome sent a second embassy that spoke more than it listened. The young tribune at its head had a jaw you could hang a verdict on. He watched the mixed drill, Persian boys and Macedonian men stepping together, and did not hide the spark in his eye that meant envy braided with dread. At dinner, he spoke of treaties with Carthage as if saying threshold out loud would make the door reset itself. Alexander led him out to the harbor by lamplight, where a ship unloaded cinnamon and scholars argued over a star's name. What do you build, he asked the Roman, when you cannot build the sea? The tribune answered without thinking. Roads, he said. A good answer. Dangerous, because it was true in Egypt. He walked the shore where the Nile fingers the Mediterranean and pinned a thought to the wind like a kite, a cut from river to sea, a ditch that would teach ships to ignore deserts. Surveyors stretched cords, priests frowned, farmers pointed at fields that would drown if the king's knife slipped. He promised sluice gates that would shut like eyelids, and he brought in men from the east who had taught mountains to drink underground. When the first channel filled, a heron lifted off, annoyed by the new geometry, and Alexander laughed, not at the bird, but at the way water accepts a plan with so little argument. Once the ground is readied, he visited Hephaestion's tomb at dusk, when the city's heat sighs out of the stones. He spoke half aloud to someone who was not there. I am doing what you told me to, he said, learning to leave a thing standing without my hand on it. He set a small iron nail on the marble. No coin, no jewel. A nail, because houses forget their roofs without reminders. Winter made the air merciful. The court moved like a tide between Babylon and Susa, law following in wagons, markets blooming and folding, governors learning that report day was not an omen but a habit. The first Roman letter arrived under the stamped image of a she-wolf, elegant and evasive. Trade, yes. Respect, conditional. Observation, constant.